Okay folks, well I hope the submission process is a bit easier for you than it was for these ants. When you're submitting your article, do it right. The editor can quickly tell whether you've followed the instructions or whether you've just done a generic approach. And this, as I explained at the beginning, is listed in the guidelines where they have the length, format, and spacing, etc. all spelled out. Do it the way they tell you, and the editor will be able to tell right away that you're serious about their journal as you follow their instructions. Tables and figures should be clearly labeled. There should be a title and footnotes that explain what's going on in the table so you can interpret it without having to look at the text. They will often ask for figures and tables to be submitted separately from the main article. In terms of copyright, open journals now attribute the copyright to the author, and you're allowed to download it, copy it, as long as you give attribution to the author. Closed journals will require you to sign a copyright agreement that says that they own that particular version, and that if somebody wants to copy it or use it, they have to get permission from the journal. This does make sense in some ways, as you can get, if you have an author who is hard to reach, then you can get permission from the journal. However, for open access journals, the copyright is automatically attributed to the author and nothing more needs to be done. And finally, you should be only submitting to one journal at a time. The reason for this is that the reviewers of journal articles are doing it for free, and that if you submit an article to 3 different journals, you're having 3 sets of reviewers all doing volunteer work, and it's just not fair. So you're only allowed to submit to one at a time, and in fact many journals actually ask you to explicitly state that you're only doing that. Most journals will require a covering letter as part of the submission process. Keep it short and sweet. It should be something like, "Dear editor, we would appreciate your evaluating this article for publication in your journal. New paragraph. This article describes blah 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 in 1 or 2 sentences. We think it's important because blah blah blah. New paragraph. We have chosen your journal because we feel this is the appropriate audience, period, moving on." In other words, it should be very short, 3 quick paragraphs to introduce the concept of what the article is all about and why this journal was chosen. It doesn't have to go on and explain all the details of the article as in an abstract. Virtually every journal these days will require electronic submission. It can be frustrating and confusing, so it's worth going to the journal website and going through the steps of the program before you use it. They will often give you a checklist at the beginning of what's going to be required and how to submit it. For instance, you may have to submit abstracts separately from the main body of the article, in addition to references will be separate again, and then tables and figures. So be sure you have all the different pieces assembled beforehand in different files if required. Once you do the submission, most electronic submission programs will have an acknowledgement that it's all gone through properly. If not, you should check with the journal to make sure that everything has gone through properly. If not, however, they will usually let you know. So what happens to your article when it reaches the journal? It's usually screened by an editor right off the bat within the first few days. And if the editor feels that it's not appropriate for the journal, either the subject matter or the content, they will return it to you quite quickly. However, if they think it's at least somewhat suitable, they will send it out to perhaps 2 to 3 reviewers, and these reviewers will then have to work on it over the next few weeks. Some journals are very quick. I know the Public Health Action requires their reviewers to turn around a review in 2 to 3 weeks. But most journals don't have requirements for time length, and you can expect the first review from the journal to come back in approximately 2 to 3 months. The editor will then assemble the reviews from the reviewers and often write a letter back to you so that you will receive on your first pass a review from the editor plus 2 or 3 reviews from separate reviewers. You then have to respond to the review and write a point-by-point letter to address every single point that the editor makes and each reviewer makes. You then send it back to the journal. The editor looks at it and says yes or no, and then may send it back to you accepted or may require more changes. It's a bit of a tennis match back and forth. When you get final approval or rejection, you'll know what's going to be happening to your article finally. If you want to look at what the criteria are for the reviewers, I've listed them here. Does the article add to existing knowledge? Is it new? Are the methods appropriate to what's being examined, and are they well explained? Could someone else reproduce it? Are the results of interest to the readers? Does the discussion include the importance, the implications, and the limitations? And are the conclusions justified by the findings? Finally, there's often a gestalt type of question: should this article be published or not? Note that most of these criteria are exactly the same criteria that we spelled out earlier in this series about what should go into the article. If you've actually addressed all those points, then you will be answering the reviewer's questions without any problem. So how do you handle revision and possibly rejection? You have to start off with the expectations of the journal. If you're submitting to one of the big journals, New England Journal, Lancet, BMJ, I think you can expect that most of their articles are rejected, and if you're rejected, it's not such a bad thing. However, when you get the letter back, read what the editor says. There's a nice quotation here from Samuel Johnson. Your manuscript is at once good and original, but the part that is good is not original, and the part that is original is not good. Your article will fall into one of four categories: accept after revision, revise, or reject. Accept right off the bat hardly ever happens. I've had it happen to me 1 or 2 times in my career, and I almost fell off my chair. It's very rare that they'll accept it right off the bat. If, however, you're lucky, they'll say, we're very interested in this article and we'd like to publish it, but we would like you to address the following points. Then there'll be some points from the editor perhaps, or at least some from the reviewers. The most likely category is number 3, where the editor says, yes, we're somewhat interested in this article, but we're not willing to publish it in its current state. We would like you to revise it and resubmit it. In this case, you still haven't convinced the editor that the article should be published, and you're going to have to do some serious work. Finally, the rejection may come back right off the bat, and in which case you'll have to move on. If, however, you've noticed that 2 of 3 reviewers thought your article was really good and your 3rd reviewer did not, you might write to the editor and ask for an appeal and say, we don't quite understand why this article is being rejected because 2 reviewers thought it was favorable. I've done this on a couple of occasions and had favorable outcomes, but in other times it didn't really work. I think in most cases, if you're rejected, if you're lucky, you've got some reviews that will help you enhance the article, and you'll have to resubmit to a different journal. In most cases, however, you'll have to move on to a new journal, and if you do, don't forget to go to that journal's webpage, download their guidelines, and you're going to have to recraft the article to fit the new guidelines. Just submitting it as is will not work for reasons I've explained before. As you're doing your point-by-point letter, you don't have to agree with every point the reviewers make. All you have to do is to be able to justify why you did not follow their advice. Once you finish the point-by-point letter and the revised article, you send that back in. The editor will then look at it and decide whether or not you've addressed the points adequately. Often it may come back one more time with 2 or 3 further points to be clarified. You respond in exactly the same way and send it back. Be sure that you're always polite in your point-by-point reviews and thank the reviewers for their input. Don't forget they've done this for free. It's volunteer work. As I mentioned to you, if you really think that your article has been unfairly reviewed, you can always ask for an appeal. If, however, you've been rejected, you'll be going through the typical 5 stages of rejection: shock, denial, anger, depression, and acceptance. I suggest you put the article away for a couple of weeks, but not too long, because you may lose interest in it. Consider another journal, and often when we're doing the first pass and just trying to decide which journals to publish, to submit to, I would suggest that you have Plan A and Plan B, so that you've got another option to go to if you are rejected. It's very important that you revise the article using the reviews from the first rejection, because often they'll point out important things that you've missed. And it's very important, as I mentioned, to revise the article following the guidelines of the new journal, particularly the references, etc. After publication, your job really is not over. There may be questions from the journal, i.e. letters to the editor, to be answered. You're also required to store the data in a safe place for a minimum of 5 years. This is in case somebody wants to do a meta-analysis and they want to have access to your data, or they're questioning how you actually did the analysis. Finally, since this is supposed to be an operation research, you must consider how you're going to move the study's findings into policy changes. That's the whole goal of operation research, and you should be thinking of that as you wrap up the article. You're not allowed to cheat. That's pretty obvious, but some people do try. Copying or ideas or text without attribution is called plagiarism, and in fact quite a few journals now use software programs that try to catch plagiarism. And so if you're going to cite either text or an idea, be sure you give a reference. Obviously you shouldn't be falsifying data. You can't submit to more than one journal at a time. You can't use ghost authorship, where you bring in somebody who's an expert in writing and their name is not on the authorship list. Everyone should take responsibility for their contribution to an article. You're also not allowed to do multiple articles off the same data set making the same point. You can use the same data set and answer different questions, that's not a problem, but if you're just republishing the same data in a different journal, adding a few more numbers, it's not okay. I've talked about unfair citation from references, and hidden or competing interests are also not allowed. These are all pretty obvious, but you should just be aware of them. Finally, I have a few tips on how to get an article written. Many people think up a protocol, devise a study, carry it out, get all the data collected, then they get bogged down in the writing. These are a few tips I've found helpful when you're with a group and you're trying to get published. If you're just starting out, try to work with an experienced author for an article or two so you find out how they do things. Work in groups. It's very difficult to do all this work by yourself, and sharing the load and the blame and all the problems is much easier. I have also found that actual writing, breaking it up into small chunks, is the way to do it. If you've written a protocol, you've already written your introduction in some respects because you've done the literature review and you've framed your article. Similarly, the method you've already written up in the protocol, and this needs to be modified. I then break up my writing into chunks. Say one day I'll do the introduction, the next day I'll do method, the next day I'll do results, and the final day I'll do discussion. You need time free from other distractions to do this. Usually half a day is enough, but you at least need 2 to 3 hours to really focus and to get into the actual writing. Trying to do it in an office where the phone's going off all the time or people are knocking at your door, it just doesn't work. So finally, I'd like to wish you good luck in your writing, and I hope you realize that in the end, the editor is your friend. Bye for now and good luck.